Alright everybody, well this is indeed a talk to car designers in Bangalore. The reason I'm doing this is because it is about the ABCs of forecasting and I've applied it to cars. I don't especially like cars. I don't drive a car anymore because I'm too dangerous, and I'm not very interested in cars actually, but I thought it would make a nice illustration of how you might go about forecasting. Now really you have to wear clothes like this, les plus forts, and as many of you know, it's a good idea to look ahead. It's an even better idea to take the lens caps off your binoculars when you do that. And everybody will tell you, the thing everybody will tell you about the future is totally unpredictable and uncertain. And that point is made with varying predictability at the beginning of all future speeches. So I'm here to tell you that I'm 90% confident that tomorrow will be Thursday. And if you look at this old issue of Design magazine published by the illustrious Design Council that I edited in my farewell issue actually, with a Galanch cover for the oldies here, you'll see that making things intelligible, otherwise known as the user interface in products, was something that I said was going to be the main event in 1982. So I think it is possible to lower the role of intuition in design and innovation, much as I'm in favour of intuition, but I think it's possible to get a better fix on the future, even marginally. And that's why in 1988, the frothiest of the Thatcher boom, I investigated teleshopping, otherwise known as Tesco.com. So that's 25 years ago. And then I did roughly the same thing in consumer electronics in Philips. On the right are some of my colleagues at Philips, which is why I had to leave. And I still get involved a little bit in new product development in IT. This is a printer for Brother, prints in A3 because small enterprises like to make bigger images nowadays. And really what I'm saying about design and innovation as a philosophy, and the kind of forecasting I think you ought to do, is to have a sense of ambition. And I illustrate this by this lovely escalator company that you can see make some 44 different kinds of escalators out of Hangzhou, including the escalators that make you shop more by walking across the floors. And a really interesting thing about it, it's nothing to do with forecasting, but it is about the ambition that I think should surround innovation, design, and even forecasting is, you'll see down the bottom left, they sell them for $15,000 to $25,000. You'll see the big contact now button, just to the bottom left of that, add to basket. So if you want 8 escalators, click on that, and if you like this one, maybe you'd like that one. Now you and I know that most of the shopping malls in China have no shoppers in them. They are just a brand play or a property play, and I don't like the Chinese Communist Party either. But I think the sense of grandeur, the sense of possibility in ordering 12 escalators to arrive at your front door, delivered in an Amazon cardboard box and a forklift truck, that's where I'm coming from. So I want to give 2 examples just to kick off with of how you might do forecasting. Most people do it by a really formalistic schematic method like STEP: social, technological, economic and political influences on the future. Since technology, economics and political life are all social phenomena, I'm already a bit nervous about that boring framework. And the framework that I usually use is to look at the news and get some hints there, inside and outside the industry I'm looking at, about what might happen. In the car industry, I began with the M5 crash in 2011, because I began to rehearse this before Bangalore with the RAC. And what was the reaction to that crash? Top hack Peter Wilby said it was all down to what I've previously heard discussed as male willy waving, or you know, the fascination cars have for speedy men. And it's not just him. The godfather of green at Surrey believes that men sort of do this stuff in cars because they're trying to attract the opposite sex. Now, of course, the association between cars and sex is entirely new to this bear of little brain here, and I'm very grateful to Tim Jackson for having made this sensational anthropological discovery. But you keep on looking at what they're saying about cars and sex, and you begin to wonder, is the problem cars and sex, or is it the commentators and sex? Because they definitely got it on their mind. And famously, the chief scientist under Labour told a woman who said, what should I do to fix climate change? He said, don't go out with men who drive Ferraris, which, as we know, is a major problem around Leicester City and all of that thing. And not just Brits, also German car designers, basically trying to abolish themselves, associating the car with orgasm, mainly male orgasm, and saying, you know, this must stop, ban it, stop it, no more of it, come on in, please. And so the first thing that raises itself for me, looking at the specificity of the issue of cars, because the methods you adopt in forecasting must always be appropriate to the object of what you're trying to forecast. There's no one schema that I believe you should employ. The first question I got to ask, and it already happened in the Bangalore conference, is more and more today people think that women are hardwired, that's the key phrase of the moment, different from men. And whether you agree with that or not, there is a growing belief that somehow there's something pretty heavy and evolutionary and hairy going on with cars, men and sex. And to car designers in India and to car designers here, and anybody interested in the future of the car, I would say, look, we don't need a car with a rape alarm after recent events in India. We don't need a pink car either. But we do somehow need to think about cars, women, cars, men, particularly in the case of a modernizing country like India. What is the social significance of the car? And it might be to do, the changes we make might be to do with the marketing, the branding, the showrooms, and maybe even the car, although nothing vulgar like a pink bumper or something silly like that. Women are more often passengers, they're more often drivers, even in India. And they are also the subject of insurance claims and so on. So if I'm investigating the future of the car, I'm alerting the car designers audience, about 200 of them. They loved it, they laughed already more times than you have at my jokes. You know, we've got to start thinking about that, and I think they like that because it's the first thing I hit them with. They're expecting to see exhaust pipes, and instead they, without referring to it directly, I referred to the events in Delhi and tried to say, well, look, what does that tell us? Does India want to be modern or doesn't it? That's really what that whole Delhi business is about, and that's quite strongly associated with, do we want to motorize or not? You know, and we'll come back to that issue. The second one is an even bigger issue, as if that wasn't big enough, which is, what do we think is happening in car innovation nowadays? And it's here that the Mandarin English edition of Big Potatoes, I happen to have several copies on sale just in English for the non-Mandarin speakers here today, £5, becomes a little bit relevant. Because this lady has declared an innovation emergency in Europe. Does anybody know who she is? Well, no, that's the thing with EU politicians. You know, they got the power, but they don't enjoy your vote. She's Irish, and she's a commissioner for innovation. And she says what we said in Big Potatoes back in January 2010, so it's 3 years ago now, that if you look at R&D, for example, you'll see it's gone up in Japan, achieved very little, footling along in the US, and really going pretty stagnant in the EU. That's business expenditure as a percentage of GDP, less than 2% in the EU. If you go to state expenditure on innovation, you're looking at less than 1%. If you look at cash hoards, they're enormous in Europe and America. Until recently, Apple, always regarded as the pinnacle of innovation, had $100 billion in American and other foreign banks, earning nothing and certainly not being invested in laboratories. So it's in that wider innovation emergency that I think we have to situate the car industry today. If innovation is slowing up, as what we said 3 years ago in Big Potatoes, it's probable that it's not going very fast in the car industry. And on the other hand, other people think it's undiminished. If you look at the R&D figures in cars, you'll find that they generally spend 5% of revenues on R&D. It's not bad. It's better than Royal Mail, which is 0.1%, which is why the postman looks so pissed off in the morning, because there's nothing happening at Royal Mail. But it's not as good as GlaxoSmithKline or Microsoft or SAP, who are up in the 12-13%. It's not bad. Could be better. And the really interesting thing is that the innovation emergency has now turned into an innovation debate, because there are now enough voices, including Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, and Garry Kasparov, the chess player in the FT, and Tyler Cowen, who wrote The Great Stagnation. There are enough voices saying innovation is slow to make the economists rush to the optimist side and say that really Robert Gordon's important paper, here he is, and he's showing here the productivity gap in the US. The green line is where it should be, the purple line in the middle is where it's gone. The pessimists, such as Robert Gordon, have been counterattacked by the optimists, such as The Economist, who maintain that the ideas machine has not broken down. Now obviously innovation is happening, and I think both pessimists and optimists are too fatalistic about whether it's slowing down or speeding up. The point we made in Big Potatoes is it's slowing down because people broadly don't want growth in the West. They don't have the confidence about risk that the Victorians had, and the Chinese and even the Indians have. And the way the pessimists describe it, however, thinking about the future of cars and innovation, is we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. McKinsey used the same phrase. Al Gore uses the same phrase. One problem, innovation isn't fruit, and we're not monkeys. And I don't believe that the whole scientific and technological opportunity has been grasped by us yet. I think if we had the will and the outlook, and we were prepared to take risks, we'd find plenty of quote-unquote low-hanging fruit. Now there are some batty optimists, famous forecasters, who are going to live forever and are loading enough drugs into their bloodstream that they will need molecular robots to keep them alive probably tomorrow, let alone in 2042, when Kurzweil believes the singularity will take place. And the interesting people from MIT who maintain that technology is moving ahead and innovation very quickly, machines are taking your jobs. My own view is that as the emergency has turned into the debate, that we were prescient and not fatalistic or too deterministic in Big Potatoes, and we were right to sound the alarm. I don't believe that machines really are taking jobs in the West any faster than they ever were. I love 3D printers, but I do not see the invasion of the 3D printers at De Montfort taking my illustrious colleague Philippa and Lee and David. I don't see 3D printers replacing them as journalists have it anytime soon. So if anything, I think innovation's too slow, not too fast. I want more innovation. I don't mind the job losses as long as we can retrain and create new industries for the people who've abandoned the old ones. And I think one way we can trace this aversion to innovation in the West is doing a Google Instagram, which a young person told me about recently, and which you will all know, but I remain oblivious of. If you trace outcomes versus outputs in Google Books, you'll see around the 60s, people get more into outcomes, man. They're into mindsets and behavioral change and attitudinal shifts and so on. And after the end of the Cold War in the late 80s, the middle way of Tony Blair, the third way, the sort of psychobabble way, really grows, and outcomes become much more important than outputs. Put another way, nudging becomes more important than technological innovation. And you can see it in cars, where already a top man at GM was testifying to the US Senate about, hey, we've discovered in behavioral economics that people are irrational. So what we're really going to, oh wow, magic discovery, the Enlightenment was never necessary. Only we have brought the realization that some people are utterly peculiar. And so they want to address cars much more at the psychological level, hey, what's new in showbiz, than in making a whole new electric car, making a new kind of output of cars. So the nudge perspective, which is carried through in David Cameron's Nudge Unit, which has published some of the silliest documents on energy and insulating your loft that I have ever seen, they believe in transport, for example, that what we really want is the low car ownership scenario in India and places like that. They say, what we want is a regime of two-wheelers fighting climate change and public transport in downtown Delhi, and what we don't want is lots of motorization and carbon burning and all of these things. You might make an argument for it, but it's less ambitious and it's more cautious, and it is more about what the EU already has a program about, which is changing your driving behaviour to save the planet. They do have, the EU in Brussels is planning lots of programs, so is the London GLA and the Metropolitan Police, to burn less carbon as you corner in De Montfort or in London. And I think that's a nudging perspective. It's a perspective for incremental change, and will not deliver the growth and the jobs that the West and indeed the East need. And you can even see it in the car companies, this innovation emergency, where they no longer want to make cars but rather want to lease them or share them, and these sorts of things. Nothing wrong with that, and nothing wrong with the attempts to do something more serious like Tesla Motors' electric car. If you look at the charging stations for the car, you know, the anytime soon perspective does rather kick in. You know, there are not going to be electric cars in any number in Britain or America for a very long time. Some people will have them, but the consequences of innovation sclerosis is that, generally speaking, we are expected to nudge our demand downwards rather than crank our supply upwards, I think one could say. Hopes in public transport, and not really the kind of R&D that would revive energy R&D to the levels of the 80s. Energy R&D is down by 2/3 since the 80s. It's quite a remarkable phenomenon given what's happening in climate change. We're not going to see mass affordable long-range electric vehicles because we're just not confident that research there would bring a return. So the first ABC of forecasting: make a folder of relevant issues to the subject in hand, and if you're at all interested in innovation, you better include Asia in all of that, because that's where a whole lot of stuff is happening. So that was just the first of the ABCs. Yeah, all right, we could start right there. How about that? Yeah? Well, then the second one is Santayana. You know, if you don't understand history, you're destined to repeat it. Now, the future is never a repeat of history, but you better understand it. And if you look back to the integrated circuit in the late 50s and the computerization of the early 60s, one of the things you learn is that a whole lot of stuff about IT is the future has been going for 50 years. And so when, you know, people go on BIS, for example, about the knowledge economy, you know, they're 50 years late. And same with media. You know, these things are important. IT is important, but let's not make our vision of the future subordinate to one kind of innovation, IT. It's a mistake. Now I like, and I watched him speak, old Howard Rheingold. But if you believe that the Indonesian regime fell because of the fax machine, or you go along with Al Gore, who's worth $150 million, in believing that the internet brings democracy, I can't get along with that. And I can't get along with the Spanish postmodernists either. And if you draw up a table, which is always good in your forecasting thesis or your industrial design forward or your media preface, you draw up a table of all the theories about the future. Mostly they're dominated by IT, with a bit of an inflection towards bio recently, especially Kurzweil. And it's a technological determinist view of the future, actually. It's missing the fact that society creates technology. It's kind of interesting, but I think just for once Mark Zuckerberg was right when he hinted that it was Arabs that created the Arab Spring, not Facebook. Right? Medium is important. In fact, you could say media are more than a mediator. I'll get along with that. Media are more than an enabler, but they're not a prime mover. That's my little, you know, similarity with Mark. I don't share anything else with him, I'm afraid to say. So what does that mean for cars, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it would make you take your distance from the Google driverless car. Not that it isn't a good idea. It's already covered 400,000 miles, but because we're not going to get one of those, you know, dominating the car industry any more than we're going to get the electric car very soon. Right? It'd be nice to think that Google will conquer the car world. But here's a reason why not. It's in red, you know, which is reality, risk consciousness, and some of those things. Now, what came up in the India speech was they had a guy from Harman in car electronics talk about Siri and the car interface. And somebody made the correct point, you won't get driverless cars, but you've already got 90% automatic transmissions in America, so we'll get stages towards the driverless car. So I had to ask, layering one future theme on another, I said, what happens in cars that is similar to the realm of what happens in the living room with consumer electronics? Nobody knew the answer. Can anybody tell me? What happens in cars around an issue that we've raised in relation to driving the same way as it does on the couch in the living room? Come on, ladies. The answer is rows. Rows happen over remote controls, mobile phones usage, and car navigation and driving style. So the idea I had on the spot was, can you move towards a driverless car that slows down every time it hears a row building up in the car, or with the children, or somebody saying fuck? You know, it's only a joke. But nevertheless, the acoustic dimension of the car and moves towards the automation of the car are certainly right. You know, but a driverless car, believe it when you see it. You know, go on, Martin.
Why do you say that when the most safety conscious industry, the aviation industry, have driverless planes virtually?
We're coming to them. You're very right. Well, I think the airways are a little bit less congested than the M5, although over Heathrow you could make an argument. There is a lot of automatic pilot. I think what you're underlining, Martin, is what I'm underlining, which is a tendency towards automation in cars is definitely out there. You know, a system of driverless cars in California in the next 8 years, well, I'd be surprised. You know, in the next 6 years, maybe 10 years, and it would be a supplement, not a replacement, right? And I think the risk aversion, not just in insurance industries, but in the whole concept, you make the rational point, which is actually that the faster we go, the safer it seems to be, you know. But as some of you have heard me say before, since Chernobyl, since this book, and since Donald Rumsfeld's famous Unknown Unknowns, the fear of the future is a dominating factor in forecasts of the future, and you can bet that will attend driverless cars even before we've got them. I mean, that's a really interesting. It's a common canard. Law and society is always behind the development of technology. If anything, I would say regulators and banners are ahead of the technology, you know, because we only have to raise a possibility, and people go a bit nervous. With the end of the Cold War, the obvious struggle for innovation against Stalinism sort of left the agenda, and many other factors have tended to displace innovation from the front burner. The pervasive concern with individual health, a growing concern with hygiene, and I don't get along with all of that, but I do think the perceptions are important. So just warming to that theme a little more, you know, the sort of cultural risk aversion that surrounds innovation and which would impede the driverless car, I started thinking about what about the perception of cars, especially in India. And I said it for my car design students in Pune, let's look for self-cleaning textiles. The first item that comes up under Google Scholar is this Indian paper about the kind of cleaning fluids that pick up the dust with nanotechnology rather than roll over it. And then just for fun, there's a deliciously Chinese titled article, Realizing Visible Light-Induced Self-Cleaning Property of Cotton Through Coating Nitrogen Titanium Dioxide Film and Loading Silver Particles. And it turns out that they already have self-cleaning seats in Martin's beloved airline industry, quite rightly. So what can the car industry, given perceptions of hygiene, right or wrong, was it something I said, Sue? You know, what can they learn about all of this from the airline industry, from perceptions of hygiene, from what's happening with chemical technology and these sorts of things? Apparently, if you shine more blue light on titanium dioxide, it cleans even faster. So expect to see more ultraviolet, you know, LEDs. Here are you know, ways in which IT maybe isn't innovating in cars as fast as we would like, but there are things to do with the sensibility toward risk and innovation that good research, around other industries, textiles, aircraft and so on, can bring. So the point of the matter is, I don't think we're very ill. I don't even think there's a major hygiene crisis. I think actually it's even getting better in India, gradually. But therefore I do urge you to collect and suspect more forecasts and to distinguish between real and perceived risks. So let me just move on and really inflame opinion, and on the third one I'll stop by asking, I can illustrate it. I mean, when the questions or the criticisms come, we can illustrate some other points. What's the problem with video games? Is it that you watch a video game and then run amok on the Montfort campus with an AK-47? No, the problem with video games is obesity, and indeed obesity is now taken up as a problem in India. Is it really a problem? Are people fat in India? Yes, in airports. Are they getting fatter? Yes, among the middle classes. Is it the number one problem facing India? No. But it's quite relevant to cars when you think about it. And it also illustrates some very interesting point about forecasting. And on this one I'll end soon because I've talked enough. If you look at the British Labour government's record on this question, they had the temerity to forecast waistlines to 2050, which was a great exercise. And here's the chart they did using the body mass index. It's worth wikiing the body mass index. You'll find it was invented in the 19th century by a Belgian and had nothing to do with obesity. Right? But according to their forecasts, and they've done our famous extrapolation of an S-curve here, 60% of British males will be overweight like Brad Pitt or clinically obese like George Clooney, according to the body mass index. And how did they arrive at this? Well, they did it through a computer model based on a number of interactions. I believe the model can only have been drawn up by McKinsey. Right? And it's all about, they even coined a new word, obesogenic environments, which means a road in Leicester that has too many McDonald's and not enough pavements to run on. If you actually read what the doctors said about obesogenic environments, they said there was zero evidence to suggest that the lack of pavements made people fat. And when you think about it, you know, it's a bit of a stretch, really. But nevertheless, they did all of this, and so it was all over the BBC, the numbers. 65% of men in 2050, that's still 35 years away, right, are going to be unable to get on a plane, basically. And so then, of course, I looked for the Indian version, right, since all of this kind of sort of government stuff, NGO stuff, health fascism stuff, I don't care what you call it. And here we have preventing obesity in India, weighing the options, right? Somebody clearly from a university background there. And then they got a sort of impenetrable chart, but the main thing, top right, encourage traditional Indian solutions, yoga, meditation and dance. Right? Well, I think this is rather interesting because where I come from, you know, BMI is a flawed measure. You know, it would be fruitless to say that these forecasts do not play a political role, because they do. Right? In fact, the latest evidence is when you're as old as me, it's a good idea to put on weight if you want to live, you know, because you'll last longer. You know, if you're thin, your bones are going to break. You've got a bit of fat on you, you can survive a winter. You know, so, well, at least that, you know, it is, well, no, but that is the latest evidence, Martin, not my statement, but the latest evidence is, and in fact, it's not only the latest, it's been going for a bit of time. Very little evidence to suggest that skipping a few meals now and losing a few pounds is really going to prolong your active life. Actually, it's going up anyway, as obesity is also going down, but whether decline in obesity is responsible. In India, if you read the reports, which is important in forecasting, to get the real numbers, you'll find that malnutrition and poverty in the countryside is the most important thing, and you'll also find that nutrition is a very important factor in child height and in general height and in cars. So you might worry about fatties driving in India, and maybe that's true of some of the middle class market, but if you're looking at mass motorization, you want to be looking at how tall people are, and the answer is in the countryside, where they're not going to be able to afford a car for a long time, they're still pretty small, right? Especially South Asia, you'll see here, the red line on the right, where diets are mainly vegetarian. So when I'm with the car designers in Pune, I get them all sitting in front of their laptops, and they'll say, okay, Google, find me a forecast of how tall ties will be in 2020. And you can't easily get it. They don't even have the backward statistics in Thailand. But if you do your work, you can gradually work out, what a car might, sensibly take account of, just anthropometrically. Leave aside gender and innovation and IT and all of these things. You can build up the evidence because you're beginning to look for the right kind of issues, As I say, health in Britain, given all those health panics, is actually improving. So I'm 60 now. By the time I'm 65, I expect to be living to 77 or 8 without a stick or major drugs, because the disability-free life expectancy is shooting up in Britain. Some of the male increase is to do with dropping cigarettes, especially in Scotland, but Scotland's a bit behind England in all of this. So what I'm trying to say is the nudge perspective, the perspective that you must change your lifestyle or meter your electricity, which is something that we take up in the other book I have for sale this lunchtime, Energized, for 10 quid, I don't think is nearly so important as innovation in energy supply, including electric cars. And I think to say that nudging and changing our individual behaviour, fighting obesity by thinking thin is the way forward, when malnutrition is such an issue in India, much more important for car designers, is a mistake. And I think it speaks of a broader problem in our sensibility about the future, which is one of limits. And it's interesting that now people are talking about peak car. Peak car. And again, I found this out because I was already looking at peak stuff, right? In the first place, being an energy man, peak oil. And if you look at the numbers, the passenger kilometres are levelling off in the West. And if you're reading, as I urge car designers to do, transport reviews, and quoting it in your documents to clients and your research work, you'll find that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in the past young men bought a car to get laid, now they go to Facebook to get laid, so car sales are not what they were. But it's not just cars that are supposed to be peaking, Facebook usage is supposed to be peaking, and then the Californian deep green will tell you that we face a world of peak everything, including peak population and the vindication of Thomas Malthus. So when we're thinking about the future, and when we read all these government reports about how you've got to stop doing what you're doing, I think it's as well to bear in mind that there's this kind of sense of closure in the West. And you can trace it again if you look at the Google Books, Instagram mentions of Frankenstein about fear, and compare them with Einstein in blue and Sherlock Holmes in red, you'll see that Frankenstein in orange is way overtaking the inquirers, the curiosity merchants, and it's kind of unleashing robots that run out of control, that run amok, that seems to be dominating references in Google Books. So with the third and final point, or maybe it's the fourth, I can't remember, about the future is many people see the future as very dangerous and horrible, and they blame you and me and our greed for it. I think that does impair innovation and the possibilities that exist. I'm pretty grumpy about that. I think it makes us impotent compared with what we could be doing. I don't believe everybody in India can or would want or should have a Ferrari, but I think the principle is broadly right. I certainly mean in favour of the motorisation of India. And so I think that forecasts drawn up by governments that demand changes in your behaviour are cheap in every sense. I don't go along with cutting back on our greed, and I think the more people turn anti-car, and they do in India, especially NGOs, the more car designers and car innovators have got to stand up for motorisation in all its forms and a cure to the climate change that motorisation will bring. We've got to solve both problems. We've got to motorise India, and we've got to check the emissions, and we've got to be very realistic about how fast we can do that. But what I'm trying to say there is, and not just me, it's also MPs in the Select Committee in Britain. Every politician will tell you we are making evidence-based policy. I'm here to tell you that a lot of the forecasts are drawn up with policy-based evidence. First you have the policy, then you find the evidence, then you say, look, we got our forecasters to do this, 60% will be fat by 2050, the scientists did it, it must be right, now do what we say. And if you're in forecasting, you can't afford to take that kind of attitude. So I got another 7 rules, but I've said enough. But I hope, disagreeable and hateful, though much of what I've said is, whatever it is, it's not schematic. Right? It does not say, what are the drivers for the future? And my question is usually, well, what's driving the drivers? You know, what it's trying to say is, India is concerned about gender. Innovation is declining in the West. Some people think we're fundamentally limited in what we can do. Governments in particular think we're limited in what we can do. Obviously there are certain physical limits, and I've got another lovely collection about all the people who believe that we've already using up 6 planets worth, or is it 8 planets worth of resources. We can talk about limits, but I think the sense of possibility and the sense of ambition and the sense in which we make the future, not just the future makes us, that sense of agency in forecasting is very important. And it's important to avoid fatalism. We're not necessarily heading for doom, and it's still within our gift to make a big change, such as certainly needs to be made in India. So thanks very much.
Firstly, how do you move beyond the selectivity of the statistics? And secondly, would you like to comment on the idea of sort of micro trends?
I would certainly plead guilty to selection. I think selection of statistics or anything, right, depends on bias, and no doubt I have my biases. What I try to do is look at an issue like cars in the round, and generally I'm trying to present perspectives to car designers and car innovators with which they will be a bit unfamiliar, and which are part of the world of the future that they need to relate to. So whether it's about hygiene or textiles or gender issues or the scope of R&D, you know, I think a creative play about the future is the most important thing, and that must involve bias and my own personal view, right? No harm in that. And indeed the whole sort of human agency perspective that I put forward is to do with active subjectivity. It's not about just selecting objective statistics that are out there. It's about interpreting the statistics in a way that allows people to think of new things to do with car design. Now, in the case of micro trends, the guy who wrote that is actually the guy who coined the phrase cougars. You might be interested to know, which is sort of 50-something women in pursuit of 20-something boys, right? And it was a bestseller in the States. And part of its microtrends, part of its rationale was that a very, very small percentage of bank funds were, to a very small percentage of US homeowners, were distributed in the form of mortgages, and that little micro trend tipped the US economy into recession and worse. I don't go along with that. I think, relating my remarks to the innovation debate, the froth in finance and the way in which mortgage finance was diced and sliced to pursue the froth in finance was a reflection of the underlying innovation crisis in America. The locus for innovation shifted from manufacturing and General Motors and Michigan and even Silicon Valley and the East Coast towards finance, and that was the major structural reason why even a small tweak in home mortgage finance could tip the whole system into crisis. I also think the emphasis on finance is misplaced, because as I showed in those figures for cash hoards, and as I mentioned in the shape of Apple, it's not just banks who are awash with money doing nothing. Mainstream companies are as well. So I think the the microtrends perspective It's not so bad actually in the flesh as the people who quote it. And I would say the same of Malcolm Gladwell, The Tipping Point. If you read the publisher's blurb on it, and outliers as well, you know, and the people who follow him and make the US conference circuit on him about their views of the future, the idea of tipping points, particularly in relation to climate change, you know, may not be wholly wrong, but the way it's interpreted, where one tipping point invariably leads to another, and then we all go into what in the Cold War was known as a ladder of escalation. I think that's very, very wrong and doesn't actually do justice either to physical processes or to the processes of climate change and to society. Sometimes there are tipping points. You can identify freezing points and boiling points, but you know, just the butterfly waving its wings in the bottom of the Atlantic, which I seem to remember cited in the first edition of Jurassic Park, so it's nearly a Jurassic metaphor. I find just all a bit airport, you know, airport hardback non-fiction, really, and I go into it in some depth actually, looking at Gladwell in the Energize book, and having interviewed Herman Kahn, who was a top futurologist, the model for Dr. Strangelove, in fact. And when Kahn came in the room, now he really was a beast. In fact, you know, his braces and everything like that, you knew he was a think tank because he looked like a tank. But he really started with the ladder of escalation, the doctrine that if we do this and Moscow does that, various tipping points will be reached and the world will end. So I don't know that, you know, in climate matters, it's an especially, you know, new doctrine. And so I think microtrends are a bit important. But I think the innovation crisis in the West, and going beyond glib views of greed or banker excess, I think that's much more important. You know, all the trends are important, but the failure really to recover the innovation impetus since the early 70s is something that's not just in my imagination, it's very much in the Robert Gordon paper, and, you know, is even accepted as a matter for debate by people who dismiss it, like The Economist. So those macro trends are the ones I think one needs to be aware of. The internal combustion engine will still beat the electric car, probably by 98 to 2%. Right? I'll tell you that now. And 2025, yeah, 98 to 2%, maybe 3%, max. I wish it was otherwise, you know, and I also wish that. I wish. No, I didn't say that. And actually, what I will show you, just the sort of innovation that I'm talking about, is more like the Manhattan Project, which is what Al Gore called for, except he only wanted it on his kind of green technologies. But maybe you haven't seen it. Maybe you have. But a company in Stockton, England, is doing a bit what these guys in Sandia National Laboratory are doing, which is very expensively at the moment. I know, Martin, very expensively. They are heating up rust to about 1400 degrees C. And if you do that, you can suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere, not out of a power plant, out of the atmosphere. It's the CO2 that Britain made in the Victorian era, actually. Most of it is that, from coal. You suck it out, you get hold of the carbon, and then you get hold of some water and you break up the hydrogen from the oxygen. You put the hydrogen and the carbon together and you have new hydrocarbon fuels. And a British company is making half a litre of petrol. God knows how much it costs. Mind you, the way it's going at the pumps, it'll probably be level pegging very soon. They're making half a litre a day out of Victorian CO2. Now, this is not the only way forward, and it may be pie in the sky, and yes, it uses up a lot of energy to make this energy, but that's true of all energy technologies. Martin. Sorry? Trees do it? I'm on it. Well, Martin, I hope you'll join me in applauding the Brazilian government for growing genetically modified trees that sprout in 7 years, unlike Scandinavia's 70 years. Where I come from, that's the kind of innovation we need, along with everything else, you know, electric cars and this stuff. this works on solar power, and here's one of the scientists looking remarkably like Roy Orbison, you know, building the, so you make these little modular solar cells and they do the business. So have a look at the one, I'll give you the address of the one in England, because it'd be quite interesting to see how, it's already received a deluge of abuse from The Guardian, so I'm liking it more and more. And I'm not saying that this is the solution any more than plankton in geoengineering or iron filings or, you know, satellite mirrors or anything else is a solution. I do know that biofuels are not taking up all the space on the planet, and I do look forward to genetically modified biofuels or synthesized biofuels, and I do know that they are already in use by China Airlines and by Virgin Airlines. Even though George Monbiot said it couldn't happen in his lovely book Heat. I don't think that impeding India's motorisation is the way to deal with climate change. I think you want to deal with climate change, it's broadly an energy question, and the energy industry is, not us, but the energy industry is the main culprit. So I would ask, why is it that Labour spent on carbon capture and storage, which Greens point out has never been demonstrated, and so long as they continue to point out that it's never been demonstrated, maybe it never will be. But under Labour government, the budget for R&D in carbon capture and storage was £6 million in the last administration. Well, this will buy you a tenth of a house in Chelsea nowadays. I would like to see more. Not that CCS is necessarily the answer, but the faster we can get to it, the faster we can have electric power that's clean, and therefore electric cars. Bring it on, that's what I say.
Well,
All right.
thanks, thank you very much.